The moment Luke Bishop's calloused fingers cracked open the spine of that old leather Bible and saw the name written there in careful, looping script, Edith Hale, beloved daughter, born April 3, 1861, Millhaven, Texas, he felt something shift inside his chest that no amount of hard riding or cold wind had ever managed to move before. It was the autumn of 1882, and the estate auction at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas had drawn a thin crowd of bargain hunters, traders, and the merely curious. The Connolly family had packed up and moved east without ceremony, leaving behind a farmhouse worth of furniture, tools, and household goods that the county auctioneer had arranged in uneven rows across a muddy yard. Luke had come for a saddle he'd heard was in decent condition, and maybe a cast iron pot to replace the one he'd dented past usefulness on his last cattle drive. He hadn't come for anything sentimental, and he certainly hadn't come for anything that would change the direction of his life. He was 26 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean in the waist, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck when it grew past needing a cut, which was most of the time. He had the kind of face that weathered well, strong jaw, clear gray eyes that could read the sky and the temperament of cattle with equal precision, and a scar along his left forearm from a barbed wire incident outside of Abilene that he'd stopped explaining to people, because the real story wasn't nearly as interesting as the versions they invented for themselves. He rode for a rancher named Calloway who ran a modest but respectable operation north of Caldwell, and Luke had been with him for 3 seasons now, long enough to feel settled but not quite long enough to call it permanent. The Bible had been in a wooden crate with assorted household items, a chipped pitcher, a bundle of old letters tied with brown string, a clock with a cracked face, and 2 tin candlesticks. Luke had only reached into the crate because the lid of the crate was resting against the saddle he wanted to inspect, and he'd shifted it aside without much thought. The Bible had been sitting on top, its black leather cover cracked at the corners but otherwise intact, and he'd picked it up the way a person picks up any object that happens to be in their hand before they realize they're holding it. He'd opened it to the family record page out of nothing more than habit. He'd been raised in a house where the family Bible was the most important book on the shelf, where births and deaths and marriages were recorded with the same gravity as legal documents, because for most families on the frontier they were the legal documents. His own mother had kept one such Bible, and he still had it packed carefully in his saddlebag, though there was no one left alive to add new entries to it. Edith Hale, beloved daughter, born April 3, 1861, Millhaven, Texas. He read it twice. Then he read the rest of the page. The Hale family Bible was more complete than many he'd seen. There was a father recorded, Clarence Hale, born 1830, died 1879, and a mother, Margaret Hale, née Bowman, born 1835, whose death date was left blank, which meant Margaret Hale was, or had recently been, still living. There was a brother listed, Thomas Hale, born 1858, and a younger sister, Clara Hale, born 1865. The last entry on the page was made in a different hand, shakier and smaller than the previous ones. Edith, gone to Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, March 1882, God keep her. Gone to Harrow Creek. The phrasing struck him as odd. Not moved to, not traveling to, but gone to, the kind of language people used when they were both hopeful and afraid, when the going had been undertaken out of necessity rather than choice. Luke bought the crate for 35 cents, saddle included, and he drove back to the Calloway Ranch with the Bible resting on the seat beside him, as if it were a passenger with a destination in mind. He did not have a logical reason for what happened next. He could not have explained it to any rational person in terms that would have satisfied them. All he knew was that he read that page again that evening by the light of the bunkhouse lantern, with the other hand snoring around him and the Kansas night pressing cold against the walls, and something about those words, Edith, gone to Harrow Creek, would not let him alone. It was not pity exactly, though there was some of that. It was not curiosity exactly, though that was there too. It was something quieter and more insistent than either of those things, something that lived in the part of him that had been growing steadily more hollow for the past year, the part that knew that driving cattle was a good life, and not necessarily the only life a man was meant to have. He read about Harrow Creek in an almanac that Calloway kept on his desk, and learned that it was a mining settlement in the northern reaches of the New Mexico Territory, roughly 400 miles southwest of where he was sitting. He had no connections there. He had no business there. He had a woman's name written in a Bible and a note that said she was gone to that place, and he had the peculiar, bone-deep certainty that she had not gone willingly or happily, and that the person who had written that note had not expected her return. He gave Calloway 2 weeks' notice the following morning. The older man had looked at him steadily for a long moment, then asked no questions, because Calloway was the kind of man who understood that some decisions were made in parts of a person that questions couldn't reach. He gave Luke his wages, a fair letter of character, and a handshake, and that was the end of Luke's time in Kansas. He left on a Tuesday in late October with his horse, a reliable buckskin gelding he called Decker, his saddle, his rifle, enough provisions for 2 weeks, and the Hale family Bible tucked carefully inside his coat. He told himself he would return it to whoever he found. He told himself it was a matter of decency. A family Bible was not a thing that should end up in a stranger's crate at an estate auction. That was reason enough for any sensible man. He believed that mostly. The ride to New Mexico Territory was 4 days of increasingly wild country. He crossed into the territory at the end of October, when the cottonwood trees along the river bottoms had gone gold, and the nights were sharp enough to see his breath. The landscape changed around him gradually, then dramatically, the flat grasslands giving way to mesas and scrub, the sky becoming the kind of impossible, saturated blue that seemed to exist only at altitude, and the towns growing further apart and more weathered-looking with each mile. He stopped in a town called Pico's Wells to rest Decker and get a hot meal, and he asked the man behind the counter of the general store about Harrow Creek. The man, who was heavyset and wore his suspenders crossed over a flannel shirt, raised his eyebrows in the way people raised their eyebrows about places they considered beneath them. "Harrow Creek," he said. "Mining camp. Silver mostly, though the silver's been thinning out the past year. It's not a town so much as it is a collection of ambitions." "You got business there. Looking for someone," Luke said. "Friend of yours?" "No," Luke said, and found he didn't have a better answer than that. The man gave him directions that involved a dry riverbed, a notched red rock formation that looked like a broken tooth, and a road that wasn't marked on any map he'd seen. Luke thanked him, finished his coffee, and rode on. He found Harrow Creek on a Thursday afternoon, and it was exactly what the man in Pico's Wells had described and nothing more. A main street of sorts ran between 2 rows of buildings that ranged from solid timber construction to canvas-walled shanties. And beyond those buildings, the hillsides were pocked with mine entrances and scattered with the detritus of the work or carts, timber shoring, coils of rope. A smelter at the far end of town breathed a steady column of gray smoke into the blue sky. There was a saloon, a company store, a boarding house, a livery, and several establishments whose purposes were not immediately clear from their unmarked fronts. It was not a pleasant place, but it was a real one, and it was full of people who were working hard and hoping for something better, which Luke could respect even in difficult surroundings. He stabled Decker at the livery and asked the stable boy, a freckled young man of about 16, if he knew a woman by the name of Edith Hale. The boy's expression shifted in a way that was not quite alarm and not quite sadness, but contained elements of both. "Miss Hale," he said carefully. "She works at the boarding house, Mrs. Purdy's place at the far end." Luke thanked him and walked toward the boarding house with his hat in his hand, because he was approaching a woman's place of employment, and he had been raised with manners even if everything else about his current situation was irregular. Mrs. Purdy's boarding house was the most respectable-looking building on the street, 2 stories of whitewashed timber with curtains in the windows, and a small porch with a swept floor. A sign by the door listed rates for rooms by the week. Luke knocked. The woman who opened the door was in her 50s, gray-haired, and had the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to not be easily impressed by it. She looked Luke up and down with the practiced assessment of a woman who ran a place that needed to remain orderly. "Yes," she said. "Afternoon, ma'am," Luke said. "My name is Luke Bishop. I'm looking for a Miss Edith Hale. I was told she works here." Mrs. Purdy studied him for another moment. "She does," she said. "What's your business with her?" "I have something that belongs to her family," Luke said. "A Bible. I found it at an estate auction in Caldwell, Kansas, and it had her name and this address recorded inside. I wanted to return it." Something in Mrs. Purdy's expression softened slightly, the way a door softens on a hinge that's been oiled. "Wait here," she said. He stood on the porch and watched 2 miners walk by in conversation, their boots heavy with dust, and he turned his hat in his hands and tried not to think too carefully about what he expected, because he had been deliberately not thinking about that for 400 miles, and he saw no reason to change that policy now. Then the door opened again. Edith Hale was 21 years old, and she was nothing and everything he could have imagined from 3 words written in a shaking hand. She was of medium height and slim build, with dark auburn hair that was pinned up but escaping slightly at the temples in a way that suggested the day had been long. Her eyes were a deep, clear brown, the color of river water over dark stones, and they were sharp and careful, and at this moment, guarded in the way that a person's eyes are guarded when they have learned that strangers showing up with news tend to be bringing the kind of news you prepare yourself for before you hear it. She wore a clean but worn calico dress and a white apron, and she had a dish towel in her hand because Mrs. Purdy had apparently interrupted her in the middle of something. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "Miss Hale," he said, and then, because he was a direct man by nature and could feel her readying herself for something terrible, he said quickly, "I don't have bad news. I want to start with that because I can see you expecting some. I found your family Bible at an auction in Caldwell, Kansas, and I thought it should come back to you." She stared at him. A series of expressions crossed her face in quick succession: relief, confusion, a flash of something raw that he suspected was grief, and then, settling over all of it, a wariness that was too practiced to be recent. "You rode to New Mexico territory to return a Bible," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "From Kansas." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held still under that look and let her take whatever measure of him she needed to take. Then she said, "You'd better come inside then, Mrs." Purdy sat them at the kitchen table, which was large and scrubbed clean, and she put a pot of coffee on the stove without being asked, because she was a woman who understood that certain conversations required the infrastructure of warmth and something to do with one's hands. Luke set the Bible on the table between them. Edith's hand moved toward it and then stopped, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to touch it quite yet. "This was in our house in Millhaven," she said. "My father's father brought it from Tennessee. It was in a crate at the Connolly estate auction," Luke said. "I don't know how it came to be there." Edith's jaw tightened slightly. "The Connollys," she said, "were my aunt and uncle, my father's sister. After my father died and things became difficult, my mother sent me and my sister Clara to stay with them for a time. They were supposed to be keeping our things safe." She paused. "It seems they had a different understanding of the arrangement than we did." There was no bitterness in her voice exactly. There was something more controlled than bitterness, something that had been processed through too many nights of lying awake in an unfamiliar bed, and turned into a kind of steady, quiet acceptance that was, Luke thought, more heartbreaking than anger would have been. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it simply. She looked at him, really looked at him this time, and he saw something flicker in those dark eyes, something uncertain and not entirely unfriendly. You rode 400 miles, she said again, as if she was still working out what to do with that information. More or less, he said. Why? He thought about lying, or at least about softening it into something more logical. Then he thought about how her face had looked in that first moment on the porch, braced for loss, and he decided that she deserved honesty from whatever corner of the world it came from. I read that page, he said. Your father's death date. That note in the different hand that said you'd gone to Harrow Creek. I couldn't put the book back down. He paused. That probably sounds like the behavior of a man who needs examination. For the first time, something that was almost a smile moved across her face. It was quick and careful, like a bird landing on a branch it wasn't sure would hold. It sounds like the behavior of a very lonely man, she said, and then she seemed to surprise herself with it because she looked down at the table and added, "Forgive me, that was rude." "It wasn't wrong," he said. "Mrs. Purdy set coffee cups down between them with a clatter that was tactful enough to cover the silence that followed, and she retreated to the far end of the kitchen with the strategic wisdom of a woman who knows when to be present and when to be elsewhere. Luke wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and let the warmth of it seep into his palms. "Tell me to ride on," he said, "and I'll leave the Bible and go. I'm not here to make trouble for you." Edith looked at the Bible on the table. She reached out and touched the cover just lightly with the tips of her fingers, and something in the set of her shoulders changed, loosened, slightly in the way that grief loosens when it finds something it thought was lost. "You're not making trouble," she said quietly. "You did something kind. I don't quite know what to do with that, but I know it was kind." He stayed 3 days. That was not what he'd planned. He'd planned to hand over the Bible and ride on where he hadn't quite worked out, but somewhere that could pass for a destination. Instead, on the first evening, Mrs. Purdy offered him a room at the boarding house at a fair rate for a week, and he found himself accepting, because the alternative was camping outside of Harrow Creek in the November cold, and there was no particular logic to that when a roof was available. On the first full day, he ate breakfast at Mrs. Purdy's table with the other boarders. 2 miners named Russ and Caleb, who worked one of the silver claims on the eastern ridge, and a taciturn land surveyor named Dowd, who was mapping the territory for the territorial government. Edith served the breakfast with quiet efficiency, refilling coffee and passing bread without making herself the center of the room, and Luke watched her the way he watched things he was trying to understand, steadily, and without pretending he wasn't watching. After breakfast, he helped the surveyor carry equipment to his wagon because the man was thin and the boxes were heavy, and then he found himself walking the length of Harrow Creek's main street with no particular aim, learning the shape of the place the way he always learned new places, by moving through them slowly and paying attention. The town had a rougher character than he'd initially read. The mining company that ran the primary claims, a concern out of Santa Fe called Meridian Consolidated, paid its workers in company script that was only good at the company store, which meant the miners were in a cycle of debt and labor that was difficult to break. He'd seen the same arrangement in other places, and it never sat well with him. The men who worked those claims were working hard for wages that weren't quite real, and the company's foreman, a wide, square-faced man named Garrett who wore his authority like a coat he'd bought too large for himself, moved through the town as if the streets were his personal property. Luke watched Garrett walk past 2 miners who nodded at him and received nothing in response, and he filed that information away in the part of his mind where he kept things worth knowing about a place. He saw Edith again that afternoon when she was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the boarding house. He'd come around the side of the building with a question for Mrs. Purdy about the water pump, which had been rattling that morning in a way that suggested a loose bracket. He stopped when he saw her, because interrupting a woman at her work without announcement seemed impolite, and then she saw him and the question of whether to interrupt became moot. "The pump is loose," he said by way of explanation for being there. "It's been loose for a month," she said, pinning a sheet with the practiced motion of someone who has done it 10,000 times. Mrs. Purdy has written to the company store about the part she needs and hasn't received it. I might be able to jury-rig something, he said, if she doesn't object. Edith looked at him over the sheet she was pinning. You fix pumps, she said. I fix most things when they need fixing, he said. It's a useful habit when you're on the road. She was quiet for a moment, working her way down the line of laundry. Then she said, without looking at him, "Why were you on the road?" "Before this, I mean. Before Kansas." So he told her. He told her about growing up in Missouri in a household that had contracted steadily over the years. His father to a fever when Luke was 12. His mother to a harder grief 2 years after that. His older brother to the war before it was done. He told her about learning to ride and learning to work cattle, because those were the skills that were available to a young man who needed to make a living and preferred the outdoors to any alternative he'd encountered. He told her about 5 years of following the cattle trails north, Abilene and Dodge City and Caldwell, and about how the work was good and the life was clean, but there was a sameness to it that had begun to feel, not like comfort, but like a rut he'd stopped noticing he was in. She listened in the way that certain people listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually attending to what he said, so that when he finished, the silence that followed felt full rather than empty. My father had a farm in Millhaven, she said then, taking her turn without him having to ask for it. Not a large one. Enough. He died when I was 18, and for a year or so after we managed, my mother, Thomas, Clara, and me. But the farm needed more than we could give it without my father, and there were debts he'd kept from my mother because he didn't want her to worry, and eventually those debts caught up. She paused, smoothing a pillowcase along its length before she pinned it. Thomas went to look for work in Houston. Clara stayed with my mother. I came here because there was a position available at Mrs. Purdy's, and I write home when I can, and I send money when I have it, and that is the shape of my life at present. She said it plainly, without self-pity or drama, and it was that plainness that hit him hardest, the matter-of-fact accounting of a life that had required sacrifice from someone who was old enough to bear it but young enough that it still cost something. "Is your mother well?" he asked. "She has her troubles," Edith said. "Her health is not what it was. Clara tends to her. Thomas is Thomas. He means well." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes a little, because whatever complicated exasperation she felt for her brother contained genuine affection. He writes letters full of plans. The plans change with every letter, but he writes. "You've been here since March," Luke said. "Since March," she confirmed. She gathered the empty laundry basket under her arm and stood back to look at the line of sheets in the thin afternoon light. "It is not the worst place I could have ended up," she said, in a tone that made clear she'd given that comparison some thought. "Mrs. Purdy is fair and the work is honest, and I have been able to send something home each month, which is the point of the whole enterprise." He fixed the pump the following morning. It took him 2 hours, and a piece of strap iron from the livery and some ingenuity with a bolt that wasn't quite the right size but could be made to work. And when he was done, Mrs. Purdy tested it with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time to hear water move freely through a pipe again. She gave him an extra piece of pie at noon and told him he was welcome at her table for as long as he intended to stay. He intended to leave on Friday. That was what he told himself on Thursday evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and watching the stars appear over the black edges of the surrounding hills. He had returned the Bible. He had done what he came to do. There was nothing holding him here except the fact that he did not particularly want to leave, which was not a sound reason for remaining. Edith came out onto the porch just as he'd resolved to settle the matter in his own mind. She had her shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a cup of her own, and she sat down in the second chair without asking, which surprised him, because she'd been careful and measured in all their interactions, maintaining the appropriate distance of a woman who'd been taught to be cautious with strangers. "You're going tomorrow," she said. It was not quite a question. "That was my thinking," he said. She looked out at the dark street. "You mentioned there might be work at a ranch outside of Pico's Wells," she said. On your way through. There might be, he said. The owner seemed like he was short-handed. She was quiet for a moment, and the night air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and the faint metallic tang that hung over all mining towns. I think you should take it, she said finally. He turned to look at her. Is that right? She met his eyes, and hers were perfectly steady. You need a direction, she said, and that is a direction. You can't ride in circles on account of having delivered a Bible. No, he agreed. That would be impractical. Very impractical, she said, and the smile she gave him this time was something different from the others, warmer and a little unguarded, and aimed at him directly rather than off to the side of him. Mr. Bishop, you are the strangest errand I have ever been. I prefer to think of myself as thorough, he said. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it was a good laugh, real and clear, the kind that came from the chest rather than the throat, the kind that had not been performed for anyone's benefit. He committed it to memory without deciding to. He left on Friday morning as he'd said he would. He saddled Decker in the early gray light, paid Mrs. Purdy for his room, and went to say goodbye to Edith, who was already in the kitchen starting the breakfast preparations. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked with him to the front door. They stood in the doorway with the cold morning air coming in around them, and he held his hat and she held the door frame, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything, and the unsaid thing between them had enough weight to it that he felt it physically, like a hand on his chest. I would very much like to write to you, he said, if that would be acceptable. She studied him with those careful brown eyes. Why, she asked, what would you write? Whatever I was thinking, he said. Whatever seemed worth saying. I don't know yet. I've never written to anyone before. That surprised her. He could see it in the slight parting of her lips, the small adjustment in her expression. Then she said, my address is Mrs. Purdy's boarding house, Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory. Anyone who can ride 400 miles to return a Bible can certainly find a post office. He smiled at her, and she smiled back, and he put his hat on and walked to his horse, and he did not let himself look back, because if he'd looked back, he was not entirely confident he would have kept walking. He wrote the first letter from the bunkhouse of the Pecos Wells Ranch, whose owner, a weathered Texan named Aldridge, had indeed been short-handed and had hired Luke on the spot. The letter took him 3 evenings to compose to his satisfaction, being as he'd never written one of this nature before, and found the process considerably more demanding than he'd anticipated. He wrote about the ride back from Harrow Creek, about the way the mesa country looked in the early morning with the light coming in flat and gold across the red rock faces. He wrote about Aldridge's horses, which were good stock, and about the bunkhouse, which was better than most. He wrote about a roadrunner he'd seen standing in the middle of the trail with the absolute confidence of a creature who owned the territory, and about how watching it had made him laugh out loud alone on the road. He did not write about missing her company, because that seemed like a large thing to say in a first letter. But he felt it, steadily, like water moving underneath ice, present and constant and patient. Her reply came 3 weeks later, and he read it in the saddle on a fence-mending job because he didn't want to wait until he got back to camp, and he didn't particularly care if Aldridge's other hands noticed. She wrote about Harrow Creek in November, the cold settling in, the way the smoke from the smelter caught the low light in the afternoon. She wrote about a dispute between 2 of the miners over a claim boundary that had required the territorial marshal to come from Pecos Wells, and about how Garrett, the company foreman, had managed to make himself the hero of the resolution despite having done nothing useful. She wrote about a woman named Alma who had come to town with her husband, who worked the northern claims, and how they had become friendly over the matter of Alma having no idea how to make biscuits and Edith being willing to teach her. She wrote about a coyote that had gotten into the yard and made off with Mrs. Purdy's best-laying hen, and about Mrs. Purdy's feelings on the subject, which had been expressed at considerable length. At the end of the letter she wrote, "You said you would write what you were thinking, and you did, and I have read it 4 times, which I am telling you because you have been honest with me, and it seems only fair to return the gesture. I think about the conversation on the porch more than I should. I think you are an unusual man, Luke Bishop, and I mean that as a considerable compliment." He read that last paragraph twice. Then he folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket, next to the spot where the Bible had ridden for 400 miles. He wrote back within 2 days. This time the letter came more easily. They wrote through November and into December, and the letters became longer and more detailed, and the distance between them in terms of formal address compressed gradually, until they were writing to each other with the ease of people who have been in conversation for much longer than they actually have, trading observations and opinions and small events with the comfortable velocity of two people who had found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that the world made more sense when it was being described to a particular person. He learned things about her in the letters that he'd suspected but not known. He learned that she read voraciously and had worked her way through Mrs. Purdy's small collection of books twice, and was now trading volumes with the territorial surveyor Dowd, who had an interesting if eclectic library. He learned that she was stubborn in the way that certain people are stubborn, not combatively, but with a quiet persistence that meant she simply continued to hold her position in the face of argument until the argument exhausted itself. He learned that she had opinions about mining practices and the company scrip system, and the way the territorial government allowed concerns like Meridian Consolidated to operate with minimal accountability, and that these opinions were not casual but considered, based on watching what that system did to the men and families in Harrow Creek. He told her about his own family, his father and mother, about Missouri, about the brother he'd lost in the war, whose name had been James, and about how the family Bible still had James's name in it and probably always would. He told her about the cattle drives in more detail than he'd offered anyone, about the particular quality of silence on the plains at night, about the mathematics of moving large animals through difficult country. He told her about what he was beginning to think he wanted, which was land of his own, not a large operation, not ambition for its own sake, but a place with a particular character and the kind of work that meant something beyond the week's wage. She wrote back about this at length. She said she understood that wanting, not from the same direction, because she hadn't been raised to expect land of her own, but from the direction of having had a home and lost it, and knowing exactly what the absence felt like in the spaces where it should have been. He arrived back in Harrow Creek on December 23rd. He had not told her he was coming, and when he thought about why, the honest answer was that he'd been afraid she would discourage him, or be distantly polite about it, or in some other way manage the situation into something smaller than what it was. He needed to see her face when he arrived, not read what her face should be doing. He knocked on the door of Mrs. Purdy's boarding house at 4 in the afternoon, and Mrs. Purdy opened it, and her expression was so comprehensively unsurprised that he suspected she was a woman who saw most things coming before they arrived. "Mr. Bishop," she said, "I'll tell her you're here." He waited on the porch again. The December air was sharp and clean, and the sky above the hills had gone the color of a bruised peach as the sun went down behind the western ridge. He stood with his hat in his hands, and when the door opened, the sight of Edith standing there with a brightness in her expression that she was making only a partial effort to contain made something inside him settle into a rightness that he'd been waiting for without fully knowing he was waiting. "You came," she said. "I told you I'd be thinking things," he said. Some of them were better said in person. She stepped out onto the porch and let the door swing mostly shut behind her. In the cold air she had her shawl, and she pulled it closer around her shoulders, and he stopped himself from reaching out to help because they were still on the territory of people who had only met 3 days in person and a great deal in letters, and he wasn't sure of the exact coordinates. "What things?" she asked. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if that's agreeable to you. I'm employed, I'm healthy, and I have intentions that are entirely respectable, and I wanted to say those things to your face so there wouldn't be any ambiguity." She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the evening light was on her face, catching the auburn in her hair, and her eyes held the careful warmth of someone who had been waiting to trust something and was deciding whether this was the moment to begin. "You are remarkably straightforward," she said. "I've found it saves time," he said. "I appreciate that," she said. Then with that careful smile that was becoming less careful each time he saw it, "Yes, Luke Bishop, that is agreeable to me." He stayed through Christmas. Mrs. Purdy, who had apparently decided that propriety was satisfied as long as she remained in the building, allowed him to join the household for Christmas dinner, which included the two miners Russ and Caleb, the surveyor Dowd, and a woman from down the street named Berta who came every year and brought a dried apple cake that was, by general consensus, the finest thing produced in the town of Harrow Creek. They ate around the big kitchen table, and the conversation was loud and friendly and full of the particular warmth of people who have made a family out of proximity and shared circumstance. And Luke sat across from Edith, and they exchanged a series of glances across the table that said, without words, that this was a good thing they had stumbled into. After dinner, when the others had drifted to the parlor, he helped Edith with the washing up. Standing at the big kitchen sink with their elbows almost touching and the lamplight yellow on the walls, he was struck by the domestic ordinariness of it in a way that reached him somewhere unexpected. It was the most right he had felt in a room in many years. "What happens next?" she asked, handing him a wet plate to dry. "For you, with the job at Aldridge's ranch." "Aldridge offered me a permanent position," he said. "I haven't accepted." She glanced at him sideways. "Why not?" "Because permanent implies a fixed point," he said, "and I'm still working out where that point ought to be." She turned to look at him fully, and he met her eyes, and neither of them said anything about the obvious implication of that, because they had both gotten used to the particular vocabulary of things that were understood rather than stated. "The New Mexico Territory is not the worst place for a man who wants land," she said finally. "There's still open range. The territorial government is offering homestead claims in some areas north of here." "I've heard that," he said. "You've done your research," she said, with the warm, slightly teasing quality that had become one of his favorite things about her. "I'm a thorough man," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of it in the warm kitchen was better than any Christmas bell he'd ever heard. He returned to Aldridge's ranch in January, but only to collect his pay and his belongings and his horse, and to thank the man for the work and decline the permanent offer with the kind of respectful directness that Aldridge, being a direct man himself, received without offense. He rode back to Harrow Creek inside of a week, and he filed for a homestead claim on a piece of land 8 miles north of town that had a creek running through it, and a south-facing slope that would be good for a kitchen garden. This was not an impulsive decision, or not entirely. He had been making it in stages for 2 months, turning the shape of it in his mind the way you turn a stone to see all its faces, and each face he'd found had held up under examination. The land was available, the creek was reliable, the surrounding country was open and good. He had savings from 3 seasons of cattle work, enough to build a small house and get through the first year without panic. And in Harrow Creek, 8 miles south, there was a woman he wanted to build something with if she would let him, and this was, he had concluded, the most important fact of his present situation. He told her about the claim on a Sunday afternoon when they walked together along the edge of the creek east of town. They had been taking Sunday walks since Christmas, always in view of the town and never in any configuration that would have given Mrs. Purdy cause for concern, because Edith cared about her reputation and Luke respected that. The January air was cold and clear, and their breath showed white between them. "You filed a homestead claim," she said when he told her. "I did," he said. She walked in silence for a few steps, looking at the ground. Then, "Luke." "Yes." "I need you to understand something," she said, and she stopped walking and turned to face him, and her expression was the most serious he'd seen on her. "I have been managing myself for 2 years. I have been the person who sends money home and makes decisions and does not lean on anyone because there has been no one to lean on. I am not someone who falls easily. Do you understand that? Yes, he said, without hesitation. And I need you to understand, she continued, that when I tell you that I am not going to discourage you from what you are clearly intending to eventually ask me, I need you to know that I am saying that because I have thought about it carefully and not because I have been swept up in something, because I am not easily swept up. He looked at her in the cold January light, at the serious set of her jaw and the steadiness in her dark eyes, and he felt such a complete and thorough respect for her that it was almost indistinguishable from the love he was already carrying. I understand that, he said. I want you to know that I have also thought about it carefully, and that I am not asking anything of you before I have something real to offer. I am building something. I want you to see what I build. That's all I'm asking right now. She searched his face. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy the part of her that needed to be sure, because she let out a slow breath and some of the careful tension left her shoulders. All right, she said. Show me what you build. He built through January and February. He hired 2 men from Harrow Creek, Russ and Caleb, the miners, who were between work when the Eastern claim played out and were willing to put their hands to something different for honest pay, and together, the 3 of them raised a house on the homestead that was small but solidly built, with a real stone fireplace and glass in the windows and a covered porch facing south. He brought Edith to see it on a Sunday in early March, and she walked through every room with her hands clasped behind her back and her head tilted slightly, taking it in with the quiet attention she brought to everything. She stood in the main room for a long time, looking at the fireplace. The chimney draws well, she asked. Very well, he said. I spent 2 weeks on the chimney. She nodded slowly. Then she turned around and looked at him. Luke Bishop, she said. Yes. I believe I am in love with you, she said. I wanted to say that before you asked me anything because it is true, and I didn't want it to seem like a response to a question. It is a fact I have arrived at on my own, and I am offering it to you without condition. He crossed the room to her in 3 steps, and he took her hands in both of his, and he said, Edith Hale, I have been in love with you since I read your name in a Bible I bought at an auction in Kansas. And I know that makes no sense at all, and I have been trying to make it make sense ever since, and I've decided it doesn't need to. She smiled at him, fully, openly, the most unguarded expression he'd ever seen on her, and she said, That is the strangest and most completely true thing I have ever heard. He asked her to marry him there in the main room of the house he had built, with the March sun coming through the south-facing windows and the creek audible in the distance, and she said yes before the question was entirely finished, which was, he would later tell people, the most efficient thing she had ever done. They were married in April, on a Saturday afternoon, in the small church that the Episcopal minister from Pecos Wells visited once a month. Mrs. Purdy stood up for Edith, and Russ and Caleb, who had built the house and come to feel proprietorial about the whole enterprise, stood up for Luke. The surveyor Dowd brought his fiddle and played something that was not quite a hymn, but had the general spirit of celebration, and Berta brought another dried apple cake, and the ceremony was conducted with the complete simplicity of 2 people who had no need for ceremony to make the thing feel real, but were glad to have it witnessed anyway. Edith wore a dress of pale blue wool that she'd made herself in the weeks before the wedding, and she had her hair pinned up with a small spray of early wildflowers that Mrs. Purdy had found growing at the base of the south-facing hill behind the boarding house. She was the most beautiful thing Luke had ever seen, and he knew that was not a thought particular to him. Beauty was not what he was observing. What he was observing was the wholeness of a person, the particular completeness of Edith Hale standing in a patch of April sunlight, wearing something she had made with her own hands, choosing something she had decided on with her own mind, and looking at him with eyes that were entirely without guard for the first time since he'd known her. He held her hand through the entire ceremony, and she held his back with a firm, steady grip, and when the minister pronounced them married and he kissed her, she kissed him back with a directness that made Russ whistle and Caleb elbow Russ into silence. The first year on the homestead was exactly as hard as both of them had known it would be, and they were glad of it, because hard work on your own land with a partner you trust is a different quality of hardship than hard work done for someone else's wage in someone else's direction. Luke ran a small herd of cattle on the open range north of the homestead and began the process of fencing his property lines properly, a job that took most of the spring. Edith kept the kitchen garden and the house and took on a part-time arrangement with Mrs. Purdy for the first season, riding into town twice a week to help with the boarding house accounts, which she had discovered a talent for that went beyond her previous role as a domestic worker. She kept the books with a precision that Mrs. Purdy, who was good at running a house but less confident with numbers, deeply appreciated. She also wrote to her mother in Millhaven, the longest letter she had written in 2 years, telling Margaret Hale about Luke and the homestead and the marriage, and enclosing, for the first time in 2 years, a money order that was larger than the ones she'd been sending from her boarding house wages. The reply from her mother came 6 weeks later and was 5 pages long and covered in the same shaking handwriting that had written that last entry in the family Bible. Edith, gone to Harrow Creek, and reading it. Edith sat at the kitchen table of her own house with her own husband across from her, and she cried for the first time in longer than she could account for. Not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from the particular release of having something to show for the difficult years, of being able to say to the woman who had worried, "Look, I have built something." Luke did not tell her to stop crying or ask her what was wrong, because he'd read enough of the letter over her shoulder to know what was in it. He made tea and sat with her and put his hand over hers on the table, and that was exactly the right amount of thing to do. In August, Thomas Hale appeared. He arrived at the homestead on a dusty horse with a battered hat and the expression of a man who has been traveling longer than he'd planned and has run out of whatever optimism he started with. He was 24, bigger than Edith, with the same dark auburn hair and a jaw that was less decisive than his sister's, and he looked at Luke with the cautious assessment of a man who is prepared to find fault but has not quite decided whether he will need to. "You married my sister," Thomas said. "I did," Luke said. "You are welcome here." Thomas studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at the house, and the fencing and the small herd visible in the distance, and whatever he was measuring, he apparently found it adequate, because he climbed down from his horse and shook Luke's hand with a grip that was testing rather than friendly but was not unfriendly. "She writes that you rode 400 miles to give her a Bible," he said. "That's correct," Luke said. "That is either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the behavior of a man with a great deal of extra time," Thomas said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," Edith said from the porch, where she had appeared at the sound of voices, and Thomas saw her and his face changed entirely. All the careful reserve of a man maintaining his dignity on the road dropped away, and he went up the porch steps and hugged his sister with the uncomplicated force of someone who had been missing her for a very long time. Thomas stayed for 3 weeks. He was, as advertised, full of plans, and several of them were genuinely good, which Luke acknowledged without letting it entirely diffuse his wariness about a man who had left his widowed mother and youngest sister in Millhaven to go look for his fortune. But Thomas's affection for Edith was genuine and deep, and his eventual approval of Luke arrived at over 3 weeks of shared work, shared meals, and a long conversation one evening on the porch about what a man owed his family versus what he owed himself, was also genuine, if offered gruffly and without excess sentiment, which suited Luke fine. The hardest conversation was the one about their mother and Clara. Edith wanted them to come west. She had been wanting it since the wedding, building the case for it in her own mind. The homestead was not large enough yet, but it could be, and Margaret Hale's health, according to her letters, was not improving, and the idea of her mother living in a mill haven that had become a place of old debts and sad memories when there was a new place available seemed to Edith an unnecessary continuation of difficulty. Thomas was resistant, because Thomas had specific ideas about what Texas owed him and was not quite ready to give up on collecting them. Luke sat out of the conversation as long as he could, and then he said, quietly, that the homestead had room to be added to, and that a man who wanted to work had work available, and that the New Mexico territory was the kind of place where plans could still succeed, because it was new enough that the ground hadn't all been spoken for yet. Something in the way he said it reached Thomas, or maybe it was the weeks of watching his sister move through her days with a settled confidence that was different from anything she'd had in Millhaven. Whatever it was, Thomas left with a promise to go back to Millhaven and spend the winter helping their mother prepare for a spring move west. He kept the promise. In April of 1884, 2 years after Edith had first arrived in Harrow Creek, a wagon arrived at the homestead carrying Margaret Hale, thin and slower than her daughters would have liked, but sharp-eyed and clearly determined to see what her eldest child had built. And Clara, who was 18 and wide-eyed, and had her mother's good humor and her sister's stubbornness. And Thomas, who was driving the wagon with the renewed energy of a man who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. Margaret Hale's first act upon being helped down from the wagon was to take Luke's face in both her small hands and look at him for a long moment with an expression that contained years of worry being carefully renegotiated. Then she said, "You are the man who found our Bible." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I lost it when I sent it with Edith to my sister-in-law's," she said. "I thought it was gone. I thought a great deal was gone." She released his face and patted his cheek once decisively. "Thank you for proving me wrong." He built a second structure on the homestead that spring, a proper addition, connected to the main house, with 2 rooms and a separate entrance, enough for Margaret and Clara to have their own space with dignity. Thomas helped build it, and they worked together well in the way that men who are not quite friends yet, but are on the way their work well, with a companionable silence, and the occasional argument about the right way to do something that resolved itself in the practical manner of people who both prefer getting things done to being right. Garrett, the Meridian Company foreman, came out to the homestead in May with 2 of his men, and a document that he claimed gave the company water rights to the creek that ran through Luke's property. It was the kind of move that Luke had been half expecting since he'd filed the claim Meridian had been expanding its operations northward, and the creek was a valuable resource, and the company had a history of pressuring small holders off their claims by legal means and otherwise. Luke looked at the document carefully, because he had learned to read contracts during his cattle driving years and had spent time with Dowd the surveyor, who had taught him the specific vocabulary of land claims and water rights. He read it twice and identified 2 significant problems with it. The claim predated his homestead filing, but had never been registered with the Territorial Land Office, and the creek in question was fed by a spring on the upper portion of his property, which under territorial water law gave him primary claim to the water. He told Garrett this plainly, without anger or heat, in the way that you tell a man a fact when you know the fact and he is pretending he doesn't. Garrett's jaw tightened, and his 2 men shifted, and Luke stood on his own porch with his arms folded and did not shift at all. "You might want to consult an attorney," Garrett said, with the tone of a man who expects the other person to back down rather than take the advice. "I will," Luke said. "And I expect you'll find the outcome consistent with what I've just told you. In the meantime, you have what's fair." Garrett and his men rode off, and the document went into a strong box along with Luke's homestead papers. And 2 months later, after a trip to the land office in Santa Fe, where Luke presented his case to a land agent who had seen this particular pattern from Meridian before, the water rights claim was dismissed, and a formal notice was sent to the company. It was a small victory, and the kind of thing that was happening across the territory as settlement pushed against corporate interest, and Luke knew it would not be the last encounter of this type. But the creek stayed his, and that was the point. Dowd, the surveyor who heard about the matter and came out to offer his expertise if needed, was retained and paid for an official survey of the property lines, which was then registered and filed, and was not the kind of document that ambiguous company papers could easily disturb. Luke and Dowd shared a whiskey on the porch to mark the occasion, and Dowd said, with the dry precision of a man who measured things for a living, "You have built something worth protecting, Bishop." "I know," Luke said. By the summer of 1884, the homestead had become something that Luke had not precisely imagined, but recognized as the thing he'd been imagining anyway. The herd was larger, the fencing was complete, and he'd taken on a hand a young man from the territory named Miguel, the son of a Mexican family who'd been in the region since before it was American territory, who knew the land with the intimacy of generations, and who could read the cattle and the weather and the country with a skill that made him invaluable and a genuinely pleasant person to work alongside. Margaret's health improved in the dry mountain air, more than they dared to hope. She was never strong, but she was present and engaged, and she spent her days on the south-facing porch when the weather allowed, reading and corresponding, and occasionally adjudicating the quiet domestic negotiations that arose in a household containing 2 daughters, a son, and a son-in-law, with the calm authority of a woman who had long since earned the right to her opinions. Clara, who was 18 and very alive to the world, found her footing in Harrow Creek and eventually took over Edith's role at Mrs. Purdy's boarding house with a cheerfulness and efficiency that the older woman described as practically miraculous, high praise from Mrs. Purdy, who had precise standards. Thomas found the direction that had been eluding him. He went to work with Miguel's father, who ran a small cattle operation on the southern range, and learned the business of ranching in the territory from a man who knew it thoroughly and had no patience for corners being cut, which turned out to be exactly what Thomas needed: a structure that was rigorous enough to hold his considerable energy in a useful direction. Within a year, he was talking about his own claim, and the talking had the quality of a man who has stopped rehearsing plans and started actually making them. And Edith. Luke watched his wife that summer with the sustained attention of a man who knows he is in the presence of something worth watching. She managed the household accounts with the same precision she'd brought to Mrs. Purdy's books, but she had also expanded. She was keeping books for 2 other ranchers in the area, who paid her for the service and respected her opinion on things that went beyond arithmetic. She had planted a kitchen garden that had exceeded every expectation and was supplying not only the household but small trades with neighboring families. She had organized, with the understated efficiency that characterized everything she did, a small lending library among the women of the area, trading the surveyor Dowd's eclectic collection and Mrs. Purdy's books, and several volumes that had arrived with Margaret Hale, and ones that Luke had been quietly sourcing from catalogs, so that there were always books moving through the region's households. She was, in every sense, exactly what she had told him she was: a woman who did not fall easily, and who, having fallen, was thorough about it. On a September evening in 1884, they were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down over the western ridge, the way they had made a habit of sitting together at the end of the day, with the sounds of the household settling around them, Margaret's voice indoors, the clank of supper preparations, Miguel's soft whistle from the direction of the barn. Luke had his coffee and Edith had her tea, and they sat close enough together that their shoulders were touching, and there was such a completeness to the moment that he sat in it without speaking for a long time, feeling the shape of it. Then Edith said quietly, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her. Her eyes were on the horizon, and there was a softness about her face that was different from the usual softness of evenings. Then she looked at him, and the thing in her expression was so simple and so enormous that he felt it land in the center of his chest before she spoke. "We're going to have a child," she said. He did not say anything for a moment because the moment required more than words could carry. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they sat like that while the western sky went from orange to gold to the deep, rich purple of a southwestern evening, and the stars began appearing one by one over the ridge, and the sounds of the household moved around them like a current. "When?" he said finally. "March, I think," she said. "Perhaps early April." April 3rd was Edith's birthday. He thought about that and did not say it aloud because some things were better left to unfold in their own time. He said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Better than well." "Good," he said. "That's good." And then, because he was a man who said what he meant when it mattered, "Edith, I need you to know what this means to me." "I know," she said. "Let me say it anyway," he said. "I bought a Bible at an auction in Kansas because someone was selling off things that weren't theirs to sell, and in it I found a name, and in that name I found a direction I didn't know I was looking for. And everything that's happened since everything has been the best thing that has ever happened to me. And now this," he paused. "I want you to know that I understand what I have. I'm not taking any of it for granted." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him, and her dark eyes in the failing light were full of something that had no name in any language he spoke, something that was love and certainty and the particular warmth of a person who has found exactly where she is supposed to be. "Neither am I," she said. She took his hand and pressed it briefly to her lips, then held it. "Neither am I, Luke." Their son was born on March 28, 1885. He arrived early in the morning, while a spring rainstorm rattled against the windows, attended by Mrs. Purdy, who had delivered babies before, and by Clara, who had not but turned out to have steady hands and a calm head under pressure, and by Margaret Hale, who sat in the next room and was not permitted to assist because her health was not up to it, but who was certainly not going anywhere. Thomas paced in the barn with Miguel, which was where Luke also would have been if he hadn't point-blank refused to leave his wife's side. A stubbornness that Mrs. Purdy found somewhat irregular, but was too practical to argue with once she saw it would not be productive. The boy came into the world with a full voice and an immediate strong opinion about his situation, and Luke held him in his big calloused hands with the absolute stillness of a man who has stopped breathing for a moment, because the moment is too large to breathe in. "He's strong," Mrs. Purdy said, with professional satisfaction. Luke looked at Edith. She was exhausted and pale, and her hair was damp, and she was the most magnificent person he had ever seen in his life. She reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger, and the baby turned his head toward the touch with the instinctive certainty of a new creature who knows where his north is. "Hello," Edith said softly to her son. "We've been waiting for you." They named him James Clarence Bishop James for Luke's brother, Clarence for Edith's father, a bridge built between two families across the distance of loss. Margaret wept openly when she heard the names, and Thomas shook Luke's hand and then, after a beat, hugged him, which surprised both of them. James was a vigorous and opinionated child who slept according to his own schedule, had strong views about being set down when he preferred to be held, and regarded the world from his father's arms with the focused interest of someone who intends to understand everything about everything as quickly as possible. He had Luke's gray eyes and Edith's auburn hair and Margaret Hale's determined jaw, and Mrs. Purdy, who came to visit regularly and had opinions about babies as she had opinions about everything, declared him the most promising infant she had encountered in considerable experience. Luke took his son out to see the land when James was 2 weeks old and the weather had gentled. He stood on the south-facing slope of the homestead with the boy in his arms and Decker grazing in the distance and the creek audible below them, and he said, in the conversational tone he had already adopted with his son, "This is yours too, all of it, the creek and the hills and the sky. You can do whatever you like with it when the time comes, but I wanted you to know it's here." James regarded the landscape with grave attention, and then sneezed, which Luke took as a favorable response. The family Bible, the Hale family Bible, which had been bought at auction in Caldwell, Kansas, and ridden 400 miles in a cowboy's breast pocket, and returned to the woman whose name was written inside it, sat on the main shelf of the main room of the homestead, where it could be seen from most angles. Edith had added new entries to it in the months since the wedding in her clear and careful hand. Luke and Edith Bishop, married April 7, 1883, Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory. And below that, in the same careful script, James Clarence Bishop, born March 28, 1885. There was space below those entries, a great deal of space. The page was designed for generations. On a Sunday in June of 1885, when James was 10 weeks old and the summer had come warm and clear to the high country, Edith and Luke rode out together to the upper part of the homestead where the spring fed the creek. They hadn't ridden out together like this since before James was born, and Mrs. Purdy had volunteered to hold the baby for 2 hours with the serene authority of a woman who does not offer what she cannot deliver. James had been handed over without drama, surveying Mrs. Purdy with his usual focused assessment, and they had ridden out with the ease of two people who understand that keeping themselves whole is part of keeping their household whole. They stopped at the spring, where the water came up clear and cold from the rock, and started its run toward the creek below. The cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the light came through them in patterns that shifted with the wind, and the air was the particular sweetness of high country in early summer. Luke helped Edith down from her horse, and they stood by the spring together in the moving light, and she turned to face him with her hands on his chest and looked up at him with those dark eyes that had been looking at him with everything they had for 2 years now. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Are you?" "Completely," she said, "in a way I didn't know was possible from the outside. I knew this was the direction of happiness when you came back in December, but I didn't know what it would actually feel like inside it. It feels larger than I expected." "How do you mean?" he said. "I mean that every part of it is more," she said. "The home, and you, and James, and my mother being well, and Thomas settling, and Clara flourishing, it's more than I was hoping for when I hoped. I want you to know that I am aware of that. I count it every day." He gathered her close, his arms around her in the easy hold of a man who has learned the particular weight and fit of the person he loves, and she rested her head against his shoulder in the easy comfort of a woman who has chosen where she rests. The spring ran its course beside them, starting its long journey downstream, and the cottonwoods moved in the warm wind, and the sky above the ridge was as blue and clear as anything either of them had ever seen. He thought about Caldwell, Kansas, about a muddy auction yard in October and a wooden crate with a cracked pitcher and a Bible on top of it, about reading a name in careful, looping script and feeling something shift in his chest that had been waiting to shift for a long time, about 400 miles of riding towards something he couldn't have explained to anyone who asked. He hadn't been able to explain it. He still couldn't, not in logical terms, not in the language of sense and reason. He could only say what he knew, which was that some things moved toward each other with a purpose that preceded any particular person's decision, and that the wisest thing a person could do was to not stand in the way of them. "Edith," he said. She tilted her head back to look at him. "Yes. I'm glad I bought that crate," he said. Her smile was the fullest and most unguarded version of itself. "The crate," she said, "not the Bible." "The crate had a Bible in it," he said. "And the Bible had your name in it. And your name led me to you. I am grateful for the whole progression." "You could simplify and just say you are grateful for me," she said. "I am grateful for you," he said. "Immeasurably." That was also implied. She laughed, that good, full, real laugh that he had been collecting since that first evening on the boarding house porch, and he felt the laugh move through her and into him, and he held her closer. And the day was warm and still and full of the sounds of living things going about their business in the particular way of a summer that intends to last. 3 years later, in the spring of 1888, Edith gave birth to their second child, a daughter this time, who arrived with considerably more efficiency than James had, and regarded her new surroundings with calm, dark eyes that were entirely her mother's. They named her Margaret Ruth Bishop, Margaret for her grandmother, who was present at the birth and cried again, and Ruth because it was a name that meant friend and companion, and the Bishop household already understood the value of both. James, who was 3, examined his sister with the scientific interest he brought to everything, and after a thorough consideration declared her small but acceptable, which Edith considered one of the finest reviews the child was likely to receive, and told him so. Thomas had his own claim by that year. He had filed on a piece of land 12 miles south of Luke's homestead in 1886, and had been building it with the focused energy of a man who had finally found the right direction for himself. He was not yet married, but there was a young woman in Harrow Creek, the daughter of one of the stable owners, a capable and straight-spoken girl named Louise, with whom he had been walking out for the past year in a manner that suggested the situation was heading toward its logical conclusion at Thomas's characteristically deliberate pace. Harrow Creek itself was changing. The Meridian Company's grip had loosened as the silver thinned, and several of the old company claims had been sold or abandoned. The town was evolving from a mining camp into something more like a proper settlement, drawing families rather than just men, building the institutions, a school, a proper church, a doctor that turned a collection of ambitions into a community. Dowd, the surveyor, had settled there permanently, and Mrs. Purdy had expanded her boarding house into a proper hotel, and Russ and Caleb, who had helped build Luke's house, had pooled their savings and opened a blacksmith operation that served the surrounding farms and ranches. Miguel had taken on more responsibility at the Bishop homestead, managing the cattle operations with an authority and skill that Luke trusted completely and compensated fairly properly, not in company scrip, not in any of the mechanisms that kept working people indebted to their employers, but in honest wages and a genuine partnership in the enterprise. It was a point of principle for Luke, born from watching what the Meridian model did to people, and it was also simply good sense, because Miguel's knowledge of the land and the cattle was worth considerably more than any diminished wage would have captured. Margaret Hale, who was 63 in 1888 and had lived those last 4 years in better health than anyone had predicted, passed away quietly in October of that year, in the room she had inhabited at the homestead since coming from Millhaven. She went in her sleep without pain on a clear autumn night with the stars out over the ridge, and the morning she did not come to breakfast. It was Clara who found her, already gone but looking, as Clara told Edith afterward, with a grief that was real and a conviction that was also real, entirely at peace. They buried Margaret Hale in the small cemetery that had been established on the hill east of Harrow Creek, in a grave that looked south toward the homestead, because Edith said that was where her mother would want to look, and no one disagreed. The service was attended by everyone they knew, because Margaret Hale in 4 years had become, in her quiet and steady way, a person that the community had organized itself around without fully noticing it happening. Edith stood at the graveside with James on one side of her, holding her hand with the serious awareness of a child who knows this is important even if he does not quite have all the words for it, and little Margaret on her hip, too young to understand but old enough to feel the weight of the day in her mother's arms. Luke stood behind his wife with his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly into him, and they said goodbye together the way they did everything, as a unit, supporting each other's weight so neither was carrying it alone. Edith entered the new entry in the family Bible that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet. Luke sat across from her and watched her write, the way he had been watching her since the beginning, with the steady attention of a man who knows what he is looking at. Margaret Hale, née Bowman, born October 12, 1835, died October 9, 1888, Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory. Beloved mother, grandmother, and keeper of our family's heart. She put the pen down and sat looking at what she'd written, and then she closed the Bible gently with both hands, the way you close something you are taking care of. She was glad she came, Edith said. I know, Luke said. She told me the week before. Edith's voice was steady, but her eyes were wet, and she did not try to make them not be. She said that the last 4 years were the best years she'd had since my father was alive. She said she was glad Edith had found her way. Luke reached across the table and took her hand. She did find her way, he said, and all of us followed. Edith looked at him. You led, she said. I had a very good reason to, he said. Someone wrote your name in a Bible. She turned her hand in his and held it. Someone wrote my name in a Bible, she agreed softly. And a stubborn cowboy refused to put it down. Very thorough, he said. Very thorough, she said, and smiled. And the smile had grief in it, and love in it, and gratitude in it, and the kind of settled warmth that only lives in a person who has built something real and knows they have built it, and knows what it cost and knows it was worth every bit of the cost. She got up from the table and came around to his side, and he moved his chair back to make room for her, and she sat down beside him in the way she'd been sitting beside him for years now, with the ease of two people who have learned the particular geometry of each other's presence, and find it the most natural thing in the world. He put his arm around her, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the quiet of their own house, in the New Mexico territory, in the late autumn of 1888, with the fire going in the stone chimney he'd spent 2 weeks on, and the children sleeping in the next room, and the Bible on the shelf with its new entries and all its old ones, and the creek audible in the distance, running its course from the spring on the upper slope down through the homestead, carrying the water that was theirs by right and by work, and by the patient, persistent, thoroughly logical fact of having stayed. Outside, the stars were out over the ridge, more of them than you could count, spread across the black sky of the high country with the extravagance of something that had no reason to be conservative about itself. The kind of sky that put your life in proportion without diminishing it. The kind of sky that reminded you that you were small and temporary, and also, somehow, exactly where you were supposed to be. Luke Bishop held his wife in the quiet of his house and listened to the night, and knew, with the full and unqualified certainty of a man who has found the thing he was riding toward, that he would not trade a single mile of the road that had brought him here. Not the mud of the auction yard in Caldwell, not the 400 miles of mesa and scrub, not the boarding house porch in December with his hat in his hands, not the stone fireplace and the pump and the fence lines and the water rights, and the second structure added for family and the cradles and the garden, and the years of letters, and the years of mornings waking up to the same sky in the same place next to the same person. Not 1 mile of it. He'd bought a Bible at an auction in Kansas because someone was selling off things that weren't theirs to sell, and in it he'd found a name, and in that name he'd found a life, and the life was more than the man who'd been riding in circles through Kansas could have understood at the time, though he'd suspected it, in the part of him that didn't deal in logic, in the part that had been quietly expecting something worth riding toward. He'd found it. And here, in the settled quiet of a house he'd built with his own hands, with the woman he loved beside him and his children sleeping and his family around him, and the land that was theirs running on in every direction in the dark, here was where the road had ended. And here was exactly right.